The UN climate conference known as COP30 opened Monday in the heart of the Amazon in Belem, Brazil. Over the next 2 weeks, leaders are expected to discuss efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect forests and indigenous communities, and boost climate financing. Brazilian President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva urged the global community to act now in the fight against global warming.
Climate change is no longer a threat of the future. It is a tragedy of the present. Hurricane Melissa, which battered the Caribbean, and the tornado that struck the state of Paraná in southern Brazil, left fatalities and a trail of destruction. From droughts and wildfires in Africa and Europe to floods in South America and Southeast Asia, the rise in global temperatures spreads pain and suffering, especially among the most vulnerable populations.
For more on the UN Climate Change Conference, let's bring in our panel. Here with us in the studio is Seema Wadhwa. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Net Positive Solutions and was recognized by Time magazine in 2023 as one of the 100 most influential climate leaders. From Virginia, Michael Shank is an adjunct professor of sustainable development at New York University. And here in the studio, Andrew Miller is the advocacy director with the non-profit organization Amazon Watch, and Changhua is the chair of the Governing Council of the Asia-Pacific Water Forum. She joins us from Shanghai in China. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Changhua, let me start with you. This conference has a lot on its agenda. There's 145 items on the agenda, and it ranges from cutting greenhouse gas emissions to protecting forests. Now, it's been 10 years since the Paris Accord was signed. Projected warming has decreased, but most experts say it's insufficient, what's been done so far. We still see global emissions rising. What do you think should be the priorities for this conference?
Well, the COP30 has set a very clear agenda. The Brazilian government, the host, the presidency has said very, very clearly since the beginning that this is the COP of implementation. So yes, you mentioned this 145 action items on the list, but somehow they are grouped in a sort of way that somehow realistically we're going to deliver some of the extreme highly priority, like mitigation, reduction of emissions, financing, forest. You just mentioned there as well, and very importantly, we need to figure out how to mobilize resources on one side, particular financial, to support the transition and adaptation for the poor countries. But in the meantime, really to make sure all the countries submit their NDCs down the road very soon, because now we only have 64 countries submitted already, because without the NDCs from each and every country, it's going to be really, really hard to mobilize financial resources, technology transfer, you name it, to really get this COP into implementation. So that has become a high priority at this moment, and hopefully somehow through the following weeks' negotiation, global leaders will be able to reach a consensus, prioritizing the actions, and very importantly, to put the acts together to deliver the targets set or will be set down the road.
Right, Changhua, China has pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by between 7 and 10% by 2035. What can you tell us about China's plans?
China has said very clearly, actually, its priority agenda in its submission of the NDCs. There are few priorities there. One, energy efficiency, of course, is absolutely the high priority. Secondly, renewable energy or non-fossil fuels definitely is another high priority, because China needs to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, particularly coal. But in the meantime, China needs to also to adapt. So for the first time ever, China has included in the NDC the adaptation action plan, which is going to set the priorities in terms of early warning response, emergency response, but very importantly, redefining how we invest in future climate resilient infrastructure. So there are many, many numbers out there already. So besides the 7 to 10% emission reductions, over the peak before 2030, China has already set even more ambitious targets in terms of accelerating non-fossil fuel energy transition, particularly wind, solar, batteries, EVs, you name it. But very importantly, China is also working very closely with the global community, particularly Global South, to make sure that China's experience, its capability has made a very strong case and also good example for other developing countries to feel more confident to transition their energy towards cheaper, affordable, and also clean energy. So China definitely continue to play its role in the international context, particularly through this climate South-South partnership. So hopefully somehow, rather than being distracted by geopolitics, China will continue to work with others to really support, accelerate the global clean energy transition.
Okay, Michael Shank, Changhua mentioned the NDCs there. Those are the nationally determined contributions, and a bit of background here. So every 5 years, the 195 signatories to the Paris Climate Accord are expected to submit these reports, these climate plans known as NDCs. At last check, according to Climate Watch, only 79 countries had submitted those reports. Why are so many countries failing to live up to their commitments?
What an underwhelming show with these NDCs, and a current tracking of those NDCs put us at only 10 to 12% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2035, when we need to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2035. So if you look at those current NDCs, and only 79 submitted so far, that gets us to 10 to 12% GHG reduction by 2035, well below what we need to be doing if we want to keep the planet at 1.5 degrees warming from pre-industrial temps. Why is it such a poor showing? Well, a lot of the big emitters aren't showing up at COP30, and in fact, we're seeing rising authoritarianism and populism in Europe and in North America, which is clawing back some of those earlier climate commitments that we saw in Paris and since Paris. So we're seeing rising authoritarianism and populism in some of the countries and continents where that leadership was once present. It isn't now, and so it's kind of saying to all countries, the way in which you plan for this may not be as necessary as it once was.
Seema, there was a warning from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He told delegates that the world is not on target to limit the long-term average global temperature increase to well below 2% from pre-industrial levels, and to pursue that 1.5% level. Let's listen to what the Secretary General had to say.
Clean energy is winning in price, performance, and potential, offering the solutions to transform our economies and protect our populations. What is still missing is political courage. Fossil fuels still command vast subsidies, taxpayers' money. Too many corporations are making record profits from climate devastation, with billions spent on lobbying, deceiving the public, and obstructing progress.
So President Trump has called climate change a hoax. The United States is not at COP30. No senior officials being sent there, no officials being sent there. What does the absence of the United States at these talks mean?
You know, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and what an important conversation. When I think about what the absence means, I think it really speaks to the fact that, you know, there is just not enough power behind what needs to be done. And you know, when we think about, when we heard the comments about the impacts, really what we're not accounting for is the financial and the health impacts that are coming from climate change. And you know, with the United States, once a leader in this space not showing up in these conversations, it's missing some of the drive in terms of the change we need to see. Now, while we are seeing a lot of progress, that progress, as we've heard, is just not at the pace it needs to be. And, you know, for a lot of people, climate change can be a very abstract issue, right? You know, a lot of people don't necessarily understand what CO2 and carbon emissions are. But where we are actually seeing it in the health sector, we're seeing it on the front steps. We're seeing it with employers having to deal with heat waves and heat exhaustion in construction workers. We are seeing it in, you know, in elderly patients and younger patients really being impacted. So, you know, as we move forward, I think there's a lot of opportunity for the conversation to shift from being one about carbon and emissions to real impacts that are happening today and being felt not only in these developing nations and in the future where a lot of the conversation has been around, but truly these are impacts we're seeing here in the US right now.
Just one point, briefly, tell us, when you say there is not enough power behind these efforts, what power is that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, first of all, we've seen that policy can drive change. In fact, we've seen it in Brazil under Lula's first, presidency with a reduction in deforestation. But we've seen a great shift in the U.S. in terms of the reduction of the Inflation Reduction Act and the subsidies. So when I say there's not enough power behind it, I'd say there's three key areas that there's opportunity. One is from a policy front, and that may not need to be at a national level. That could be at a local and a state level. The second area is there's not enough power behind it because the will of the people, this is an abstract issue. The opportunity to make this real and personal for every individual to matter. And then I think the third thing in terms of there's not enough power behind it, it's the capital and the financial elements, right? By accounting for the real cost of climate change, these three things put together can put force behind the work that needs to be done.
Okay, Andrew, good to have you back with us. Now the conference is being held, as I said, in Belem, which is in the heart of the Amazon. Brazilian President Lula da Silva, he's announced a rainforest protection fund called the Tropical Forests Forever Facility. Brazil hopes to raise $125 billion, that's both public and privately sourced. I mean, what can you tell us about this initiative and who will benefit, how it will work?
Well, the need to get funding directly to communities, and in particular indigenous communities around the world, is crucial. They're really the people who protect the rainforests, and they need the resources to do that. Unfortunately, there have been all kinds of different schemes or ideas for how to channel financing to communities, which hasn't ultimately gotten funds to them. We're kind of cautiously optimistic about this initiative, but have a number of major concerns. I mean, one is who's going to actually receive the funding. My understanding is that the funds are channeled through governments. And so governments of goodwill could pass those funds along to communities, but governments of not so goodwill could keep the funds themselves. So who gets the funds are really important. How the funds are used is also important. Ideally, these funds are going to communities, to productive projects, to sustainable economies, to land titling for indigenous communities, which is a really crucial step that needs to happen in terms of protecting rainforests, to different kinds of bilingual education, to health initiatives, among others. So what it gets used for is important. But another key point is, where do the funds come from? And this is a major concern with this fund is, are these funds going to come from the profits of industries that are also directly involved in destruction of rainforests? Is it going to come from the beef industry? Is it going to come from the oil industry? Is it going to come from the mining industry? And so it's very important that these funds should be coming from investments that are not themselves directly destroying the rainforest or contributing to climate change.
One other point, Andrew, one of the biggest challenges in the Amazon has been logging. Does this fund address that in any way?
I can't say that it does. I mean, I would leave that to the, I mean, I hope it does. If it doesn't, frankly, then that's going to be a major existential problem for this initiative. But like I said, what we really need to see right now in the Amazon is support for grassroots communities, in particular indigenous peoples. Land titling is central to that, but also making the Amazon a no-go zone for major extractive industries like oil, gas, and mining. Another major issue that we're seeing, unfortunately, around the Amazon are illicit economies, are the expansion of narco-trafficking, of illegal gold mining, of illegal logging, as you mentioned. And so that's an issue that really needs to be addressed in a collaborative way amongst all the governments, and they need to attack corruption, they need to have sort of multinational efforts, and they need to attack the impunity with which these illegal actors are carrying out human rights violations and are killing local leaders. All those things need to happen in order to protect the Amazon.
Okay, Changhua, well, I want to take a closer look now at some of the efforts, in fact, most of the efforts that China's been making. It's a global leader right now in clean energy, and looking at the figures, it manufactures more than 80% of the world's solar panels, 75% of electric vehicle batteries, and more than 60% of wind turbines are manufactured by China. So the question is, where does China go to from here?
China will definitely continue to accelerate and go deeper. And as all the numbers, actually data show that China is already well positioned in leading global clean energy transition. If you look at the just announced national strategic thinking around the next 5 years planning, and so China is doing much deeper, more complex, systemic sort of way of thinking in terms of how to further enhance the foundation for accelerated clean energy transition. If you look at the power system, the grid system, and the infrastructure needed, but very importantly, also really enhancing the governance, accountability, transparency, disclosure, you name it. And there is the other very important sense about capability, and particularly the younger generations. I think this early on the conversation was about either or, particularly the current context actually in the US is either or issue. But for China and many other emerging economies, it's both and because we have to do all the efforts we have to. But in the meantime, I think we started to recognize that there's a very strong synergy, co-benefits, win-win, in that sort of context there, so that it's no longer an either-or situation. So on the China side, China has already set a few key targets for the next 5 or 10 years, besides the NDCs. So now the next 5 years will cover, the efforts until 2030. We'll continue to deliver our global commitment of peaking before 2030. And we already achieved 6 years ahead of time in terms of solar and wind energy installations. We said by 2030 we're going to deliver 1,400 gigawatts. We already achieved that, and so China is set a little bit another tripling targets to go forward. In the meantime, we do need to make sure the financing, green financing, is mainstreamed. Right. So the conversation is no longer about say, okay, how much money needs to be dedicated actually to green finance. Rather, China's national strategic focus planning pretty much mainstreaming clean energy transition, clean economy, and finance has to come with it. So China's strategy and plan for the next stage is much integrated system sort of restructuring for the next stage of accelerated transition. So the conversation or narrative, the page China is already on, is a little bit different actually, maybe somewhat tremendously different from what the conversation is happening in the US at this moment.
Okay, Michael Shank, China is making good progress, but at the conference, the Brazilian diplomat André Correa do Lago, who is also president of these climate talks, he says rich countries have lost enthusiasm for combating the climate crisis. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I think that China has a very elegant attitude that they don't give lessons to other countries like sometimes some countries do, and they do the best they can do, and this has been somehow a revolution in this new economy that is emerging, and there is no country that is betting so much on this new economy than China, by really concentrating on technologies, on scale, on quality, and in finding solutions that really, at the end, benefit everybody.
So, Michael, this goes back a little to what we were talking about earlier on NDCs, but what do you believe needs to happen for more developed countries to get on board?
Well, I appreciate how many interviews Delago has done in prep for COP30, and props to CGTN too for interviewing him. I encourage everyone to watch that full-length interview with Mike Walters. It's a great interview. And to his credit, he's encouraging others to be like China in all the ways that Changhua has already mentioned, that you've mentioned, Anand, in terms of their leadership across solar, wind, battery storage, heat pumps, electric vehicles, charging stations, and more, to make it affordable globally for developing countries to make the green transition quickly. Now, in terms of how do we get some of the biggest emitters to really lead when the NDCs were underwhelming, as you've already noted, Anand, if you look at the UN's goals for COP30, it's to get a plan in place, making sure countries are planning appropriately and aggressively for 2035. It's to get countries to pay for the transition, it's to get countries to repair the damage done to countries around the world that are suffering from disproportionate burdens and impacts from climate change. And they even talk about re-Parising, finding the mojo again from Paris. And frankly, I don't know if that's the fix. With all due respect to the UN, I think we need to rethink how we convene. We've done this for 10 years. The NDCs are underwhelming. We're overwhelmingly behind where we need to be, as I've already talked about. We're only at 10 to 12% GHG reduction by 2035 when we need to be at 60% GHG reduction by 2035. Frankly, maybe we need to consider a global investment conference where countries come to the table to think about investing the way that China has done across solar, wind, battery storage, EVs, heat pumps, and more, or a security conference to talk about displacement and migration. We're seeing in the Philippines, 1 million people displaced from typhoons that has been exacerbated by climate change. We'll continue to see this kind of displacement migration happen globally. Maybe we should frame this as a security conference, or maybe even, as Seema has already mentioned, a health conference where the health impacts are known, they're only rising in terms of heat impacts, heat-related deaths, but also pollutants, pollution-related death. And if we cut down these forests, that is killing the lungs that we depend on to keep us alive and thriving. So I'm thinking of all the ways in which we could rethink this moment, because after 10 years, we are not where we need to be.
Seema, let's talk a little bit more about something that both you and Michael have talked about, and that is the impact on people's health that climate change has. The World Meteorological Organization announced that 2025 will be the second or third warmest year on record, average temperatures in August hitting 1.42 Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And there could be, and this is the frightening figure, there could be an additional 2 million temperature-related deaths by the end of the century. So what do you expect to come on that particular issue out of this conference?
You know, I think over the last 5 years, we've seen an exponential rise in terms of how health is being centered when it comes to climate change. And I think the reality of why that's happening, it's not political will, it's the fact that people's lives are being impacted today, their health, their children's health, their parents' health, it's all happening real time. So in terms of what do we expect to happen now, sadly, COP28 was the first time ever, 28 times coming together, the first time ever that there was a dedicated health pavilion at a COP. So where we are today at COP30, you know, there are more and more health leaders at the table as part of the conversation. And I think, quite honestly, it is, you know, as Michael also alluded to, we are going to have to find a different way to talk about and address and make real these challenges where people are understanding that it's not just some, you know, theoretical challenge in the future. And, you know, another thing I would say to that is, it's not only that it is impacting health, it is actually then also impacting the financial outcomes from that. You know, I think I've shared previously that, especially here in the United States, where we need to have more climate action happening, you know, a lot of those external health costs are currently not being accounted for anywhere. When we have these stats on the number of billion-dollar events that happen in the U.S., they don't account for the health-related costs. They're not accounting for, you know, how much large companies are paying for their employees when they go into the ER and when they're admitted for these patients, you know, these patients are admitted. And, you know, so I would say if Paris was about making promises, what's different now, 10 years forward, is I hope that this COP is about people and not promises.
Right. Andrew, health leaders are at the table, but another significant development is that Indigenous leaders are also at the table. In fact, a flotilla carrying Indigenous leaders and activists made the long journey, 25 days, up the river to Belem. Here are what two of those leaders had to say. Let's listen.
We need to have a good dialogue and sit at the table as Indigenous people and engage in positive negotiations so we can obtain clean fuels that don't pollute and stop future spills.
The most important thing is the Indigenous young people are in the front lines, protecting the rivers, protecting the forests, protecting the jungle. So for me, this is the hope. This is the time for the Indigenous youth too.
So Andrew, how significant is it that Indigenous leaders are there?
Well, we're tremendously proud to have supported the Yakumama delegation and flotilla, and there are others that are actually arriving from other parts of the Amazon. bringing different messages from communities. And that's absolutely crucial. Indigenous leaders from the Amazon and from around the world have come to these climate summits for decades, really, and have been there and have been working to underscore the issues that they're facing, that climate is bringing to them, but also the grassroots solutions. And so this is a key point that has been hammered home for many years, is the importance of inclusion, not just of Indigenous peoples, but of grassroots communities of all sorts, who are often the first affected by climate change and the people who are least responsible for it happening. And so this is a tremendous climate injustice. And it's been a longstanding demand to have those voices incorporated in a meaningful way, not just as sort of window dressing and not just having some nice Indigenous peoples to kind of accompany the photo op or whatnot, but for their voices to really be brought and centered. And unfortunately, in many cases, that means that they're going to be kind of conflicting with other major interests that are also very present at these climate summits. I mean, the fossil fuel industry and the lobbyists that are there are in force. There are hundreds of fossil fuel lobbyists who are there. And so it's very important that these voices are able to be centered in these dialogues, and the grassroots solutions that they're bringing are actually incorporated into the final outcomes.
Michael, very quickly, I've only got about 30 seconds, but do you think enough is being done to promote the economic benefits of shifting to clean energy?
Well, I think the U.S. is being woefully outcompeted. They are missing the opportunity to seize on the economic benefits. China invested early in the things we've already mentioned: solar, wind, batteries, storage, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and more. So they will win this in the end. So a lot more could be done to up the U.S. investment, the European investment in this space. China is winning currently. It's a missed opportunity for a lot of investors in the U.S., though. So more could definitely be done.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.